Today we're wrapping up gym class with Developing Staying Power Part 2. So here's what I need you to do. I need you to turn to the person next to you and tell them the last thing you lost. Okay, now look back up here. Hey, the quicker we get done, the quicker we get out, okay? How many of you said the last thing you lost was your keys? Good number of you. I'm not really a very forgetful kind of key person, but back growing up in Ohio, in the wintertime, we would go out early, like 10 or 15 minutes before we were supposed to leave to go somewhere to start the car in the wintertime to get all the frost or ice or whatever, get it to a temperature inside the car that didn't hurt. And my senior year at high school, I would be driving myself and my younger sisters to school every day. And of course, the wintertime, I went out one morning. It was particularly cold, a lot of frost, a little bit of ice. Started the car and came back in and was feeding the dog and getting ready and reminding my little sister, did you get your book and this? And then I said, okay, it's time to go. And then I panicked. I couldn't find my keys. And no, I'm not joking. I spent 10 minutes, each moment getting increasingly stressful because I could not find my keys until finally my sister said, ding dong, you started the car. Now, back then, there wasn't Apple with all of the products, but I could have used Apple back then because I could have used a product called Tile. How many of you know what Tile is? Tile is one of those things, how many of you realize you need Tile? It's one of those things, you just put that little doohickey right there on your keychain, and then it connects to your smartphone, and then if you can't find your keys, you just hit that little button, and that makes a noise, tells you where your keys are. Of course, for some of you, that doesn't help you because you can't remember where you put your smartphone. But that's kind of how Tile works, because it's important. How many of you would agree, show of hands, it's easy to forget stuff these days. It really is. And James is writing here, and James is saying they're a huge part of followers of Jesus developing staying power is remembering the essential characteristics of Jesus. Now think about this. James is writing to the only known church of the day, and his book is the only known book of the scriptures of the day. And he's saying that this early church, this very first church, was in danger of forgetting some of the essentials, some of the basics that mattered the most. See, it's not just a 21st century issue. Think about this. James is pastoring a church in what city? Talk to me. Jerusalem, right. And Jerusalem, keep in mind, is where Jesus had come. Jesus had been led through a mock trial. He had been prosecuted. He was persecuted. That's where he hung on the cross. That's where they put him in a grave. That's where he conquered death, hell, and the grave, rose again on the third day. This was also where Jesus took the road with the guys on the walk towards a community called Emmaus. It's where Jesus had come back in when about 120 people were gathered in the upper room, that Jesus comes in there and he speaks to themselves. This is where the Holy Spirit was given, and the birth of the church took place when 5,000 men plus women and children said yes to saving faith on Jesus Christ at the very first church service. That's Jerusalem. And that church right there, day one, has a pastor whose name is James, and James is the brother of, see, you guys did go through this course with me, way cool. And now we're just talking months, maybe no more than a couple of years max. And they're already starting to forget the basic characteristics of why they exist as a church. And so here it is at the end of this book, James says to this new church that if you forget the essential characteristics of who Jesus is, then all is lost and church doesn't matter. See, the hardest thing to do is remember when you become stressed. Anybody here ever forget anything when you're stressed? Well, let me walk you through. There's been some research done on this, and I caught a TED Talk done on this by a lady named Elizabeth Loftus. And there's a little box. Put that up there. And she has broken down very simply why we forget. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner, she says part of the reason we forget is what she calls retrieval failure. Her explanation is this. There is a decay of where that memory is in your brain and the pathway to get to it. And over time, memories that are not used regularly simply begin to fade. Basically, that's a polite way of saying if you're over 50 years old, you become forgetful. And then the next one over there is called interference. Interference is when you try to remember something, but you have another memory that is kind of similar to it, and those memories get confused with one another. For instance, if you have multiple children or multiple grandchildren, have you ever called one of them the wrong name? See, everybody over here is under 50 is going, oh yeah, we're confusing these two things. And then you have the failure to store. Failure to store says this. You have a memory, and it's in your short-term memory, but before you can put that into your long-term memory, someone interrupts you. That's code for saying you have a 2-year-old in your house. And then the final one is where I want you to focus yourselves this morning. It's called motivated forgetting. And here's why I want you to focus on this one today. Because there is a direct relationship from this to James chapter 5. Because you have a stressful, a discouraging, maybe even a depressing experience in your life. And your mind then expels that memory, and you don't find it on purpose. Now, every one of us in here can identify with this. So, like, for instance, have you ever had to study for a stressful final in a class you didn't like? And 5 minutes after the test, you couldn't remember anything that was on it, right? You just chose to forget it all. Some of you do this on a weekly basis. You go and sit down and eat like a half a gallon of ice cream, then you just forget it all. Or maybe you eat half a pie. Or maybe you eat half a pie with a half a gallon of ice cream, and you're just motivated to forget. For some of you, though, it's a little bit more than that. See, some of you in this room have had an extremely stressful trial. You've been through a traumatic personal experience. You've gone through an elongated time of personal discouragement, and our minds are motivated to forget those kinds of things because those kinds of memories make us feel bad. They discourage us. They depress us. They drag us down. They're painful. And that's where James is going today with the people in the first church as he's teaching them how to develop staying power. And if it was important in the first church, maybe it's important in our church. And so just a few things, if you got your notes there in the middle of your outline, your worship folder, let me just remind you where James came from as we walked through the first part of this last week. Last week we said, number one, that we struggle with hoarding, and we should replace hoarding with generosity. James says, don't double down on selfishness when you come up against difficulties in life. To be generous, even in the midst of your own frustrations. James says the second thing is important is that exploitation becomes replaced by empathy. He says your problems get smaller when you focus on the needs of other people. And then thirdly, James says, when you're tempted to compromise, don't compromise, but compromise should be replaced by perseverance. See, the tendency is when you're discouraged is that you want to rationalize things away. See, life has seasons, and all seasons are cyclical, right? Like if you live in the Midwest or the North, you can't wait for the winter. You just want to sleep through winter and wake up about mid-spring, right? And then you want summer to last, and sometimes summer doesn't last. And fall's kind of nice and colorful, and the evenings are cool, and the days are warm, and then winter comes again. And life has seasons similar to how our physical world, our physical environment has seasons. And James says our tendency is to want to rationalize, but don't do that. He says, because when we rationalize, then what we want to do is compromise when we're in that season of discouragement. James says, don't do that. James says, be patient, and in your patience, persevere. And here's why that's so important. Because the number one thing that discouragement does to anyone who becomes affected by it is discouragement robs us of resolve. When you're discouraged, it robs you of being resolved. And when you lose resolve, you begin to compromise your convictions for whatever it is you were dealing with. Let me prove it to you. How many of you ever got up one day and said, you know what? It's time for me to start taking my health and my fitness a little bit more serious. So you went out to like the local rabbit hole in your neighborhood and found out what the bunnies ate. And then you went to Sprouts and you bought the stuff that the bunnies eat because you're going to eat bunny food for the next couple of months. You were so serious about this. You even got on your treadmill 2 days in a row. 3 days into this, you got up, you went into the bathroom, you pulled out the scales, you stepped on the scales, gained weight. You been there? You lose all resolve. Next thing you know, you're out getting a supersized Big Mac and fries. You lose resolve. Same thing happens. You decide you're going to get serious about your financial picture. Maybe you're going to start planning for retirement, the kids' college, whatever it is you're dealing with. And you're going over your finances and you're a little bit discouraged. You've been praying about it, and wouldn't you know it, God answers your prayer. You go and you get in your mailbox, and there is a $500 check you never saw coming. You're all excited. You're sharing it with your small group, your connection group that night. You're praising Jesus. The next day you go out and there is a $600 medical bill you never saw coming. And you don't care anymore. Now those are extreme, but whether it's diet or finances or whatever issue you're dealing with in your marriage, in your family, in your job, in your education, in this church, whenever you get discouraged, it begins to chip away at your resolve. Is that fair? And so we've got to figure out what it is that God's saying to us in the midst of that. And here's why this is so important. If anyone can walk us through discouragement and teach us to persevere, it's James. You're like, David, how do you know that? Here's how I know that. Because we're in this room this morning. See, if James hadn't led the first ever Christian church who was enduring heavy persecution, if James hadn't effectively led them through discouraging times, there may not have been a second church, and there certainly wouldn't be a Connect church. And so James wants to lead us through what all of this looks like. So let's pick this up in the middle of James chapter 5, part 2 of this series about developing staying power. So he's talked about all of these other things. So it looks like number 4 there in your worship notes, and it says this. We have grumbling get replaced by perseverance. You see, perseverance is a huge theme for James. It was huge for that early church. I think it should be huge for us. It's a major theme, and it's real important. And this is so important. Here's why. Because when you grumble in discouragement, you add fuel to the fire of depression. And James says in chapter 5, verse number 9, don't grumble. Now, circle that word grumble, if it's there in your Bibles or in your worship notes. What does James mean by grumbling? Well, he means, grumbling in this case literally means murmured grievances. For those of you who were with us last summer, and we did that series called The Land Between, what was the number one indictment God had against Moses and all the children of Israel? That they were what? Full of grumbling and murmuring. So this is what James is talking about. It literally means murmured grievances. It's like this. Some of you have done this in the last week, and some of you haven't done this for decades, but it'll immediately come back to you because you aren't motivated. Forget this. You're having a conversation or an argument with your 12-year-old. And you finally say, young lady, I don't want to hear any more. That's the way it's going to be. Now let's just go get it done. And as she turns around and starts walking away, she says something under her breath. Young lady, what did you say? I was just reciting the ABCs. And what's happening is she's walking away and she's got anger and irritation and tension and frustration built out, but mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or whomever she's having this conversation with, she doesn't really have the guts to look you in the eye and say it out loud because she knows there's consequences of that. But as she turns her back and walks away, she says it about half under her breath, just enough to get the steam out of her and to irritate you. Does that sound right? How many of you just had this conversation with your 12-year-old recently? Oh, yeah, the Williams family, I know. Now, here's the deal. Look at verse number 9. James says, don't grumble. And then who is James talking to, and who are they grumbling about? Don't grumble against one another. Then he uses a total insider church term just to give it context, brothers and sisters. Nowhere else in the world do they call public people brothers and sisters except the church, right? So James is saying, don't grumble against one another. Don't do this in the family of God, or you will be judged. Wish I could do like James Earl Jones' voice right there. Wouldn't that like be a cool effect? If Donald knew what he was doing in the sound system, he made me sound like James Earl Jones right there. The judge is standing at the door. Circle that word door, and here's why that's important. What James is reminding them of is that God is always very near. God is always very near. It would be as if James were telling we as a congregation to not be grumbling and murmuring against one another because God's standing right there listening to you. You tracking with me? That's what he's saying. God is always very near. I had a coworker one time. He and his wife had a 2-year-old daughter, and just to kind of give his wife a little bit of a break, but also to start teaching their, at that time, only child some social skills, they decided they were going to start putting their 2-year-old daughter into daycare 2 days a week. But this particular daycare they chose had a rule about the children who came in there. The children who couldn't come in there could not bring like their personal teddy bear or their personal blanket or anything like that, that it was part of the growth process. And when they told my friend and his wife that, their little daughter, Maddie, had her blanket with her, and she couldn't take it with her, and she had to give it back to mom and dad, and she was mad. She thought they were the enemy. And so what Maddie decided she was going to do is that she would not ever talk to them because they were mean people. And so for like the first couple of weeks she's in there, 2 days a week, she never said a word. Now at home, she was a chatterbox like her dad is. But there in the daycare, she literally never said a word. And finally, one day, the daycare people said, hey, you guys, your daughter's got problems. You need to get her checked out. And they're going to like, our daughter's fine. They're going to look, she doesn't talk. She talks all the time at home. When she doesn't talk, she's going to have social anxiety disorder. You got to get her all checked out. So they take her to the pediatrician, and he's running some tests on her. And finally, he looks at her, and he's trying to talk to her, and she won't talk to him either. The reason she won't talk to him either is she found out that the daycare people said she had to go see him, so she associated the doctor with the daycare people, and she wasn't going to talk to them either. And so he looks at her, and he says, well, Maddie, here's what I want you to do. Look at me and go like this. Now, I don't know exactly why. There's something that pediatricians understand, that kids' minds and their body and their functions, and it all connects if you're doing that on cue. And so he turns away to make a note in his file, and when he turns his back to Maddie, and her parents are kind of sitting there in the back room, she goes, and my friend has a big sense of humor, and he starts kind of laughing, and the doctor turns around, and he catches a glimpse of her doing something, but he wasn't sure what. And he asked my friend, he said, well, what did your daughter do? And they kind of basically in code said to him, tell her to do it again, but then when you turn around, kind of watch. And so, Maddie, do this. And he turned back around and caught her doing it. And he looked at my friends, and he said, your daughter is just fine. There's not a thing in the world wrong with her. But the point of that is this. This little girl who's angry and upset and in her mind doing her own little form of 2-year-old grumbling, right? Didn't realize that the physician was watching her behavior. And when James says, you will be judged, and the judge is standing at the door, what he's saying is, church, God is always watching your behavior. Sometimes we think that because of all the things that they went through back in the early period of the first century, in the earliest stages of the church, once Jesus was resurrected and the church actually started becoming a movement, that all they did is they were so grateful and they were under persecution, they just sat around saying kumbaya and prayed and rejoiced, and everything was hunky-dory in the family of faith. James is letting, and the 21st century church, we're the ones that got it all screwed up. And James was going, no, human nature is human nature. And you think we've got problems? Our problems are just 21st century versions of the problems they had back in the first century. And so James is teaching them, he says, don't grumble because the judge is standing at the door. He says, brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. If you've got room there in the margins of your notes, somewhere out to the side, write these words. Others have gone through this. God helped them, and he will help me. That's what verse 10 is saying. You're not the only one who's going through struggles and trials and tribulations. Others have gone through this, and just as God helped them, he's also going to help me. In verse 11, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. There's that word again. You have heard of Job's perseverance. Now, what was Job's perseverance? Well, you might recall if you read the book of Job in the Old Testament, Job was like a very righteous man, and Satan kind of had open season on him, except he couldn't take his life. So Job's going through all these physical and emotional afflictions. He's got boils all over his body. And to try and encourage him, Job's wife and some of his best friends come into the room, and they look at Job and say, why are you sitting there honoring God? Curse God and die. It wasn't exactly the spiritual gift of encouragement, right? And while they're having the conversation, in Job chapter 38, verse number 2, God literally comes in and interrupts their talking to Job, his servant, and God says, basically, you are talking with words that have no knowledge. See, that's what the word grumbling means. Grumbling are words spoken with no knowledge. Have you lived long enough to realize that some people in life are just fault finders? No matter where they go, they'll find fault in this church, and when they find fault with this church and get mad at me, they'll go down the street and they'll find fault in the next church. There are people who are going to find fault in their boss or whatever job they're on, whatever school they go to, whatever teacher they have. They're going to find fault with their neighbors, and when they move to the next city, they're going to find fault in those neighbors. And if you're that kind of person, don't be surprised if some point in your life God just interrupts you one day and says, listen to what you're saying because you're non-significant. We have heard of Job's perseverance, and we have seen what the Lord finally brought about because the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. See, folks, James is telling his people there, and I think James is saying to us this morning in gym class, you can grumble or you can act, but you can't do both. But if you choose not to grumble and you choose to act, understand that God is full of mercy and compassion. Why don't you make a plan for your life based on what God can do with you? Grumbling replaced by perseverance. Number 5 says, empty promises replaced by integrity. Empty promises replaced by integrity. In verse number 12, James says these words. He says, above all. Now, where's James going? When James says above all, James says whatever the norm is, whatever's being said, whatever's being shared, your integrity should rise a level above everything else. If James were here today, he would probably want to go speak at the National Association of Advertisers. A few weeks ago, and I don't remember because I have motivated forgetting, I shared with you some really specific statistics about the number of ads and commercials and things you'll see every day of your life, and it consumes like 3 years of life. Some of you were here for that. I don't remember those exact specifics, but I do remember that all of us are bombarded with all kinds of advertisements, and these advertisements will promise things that the people who produce the products know they can never fulfill. Let me give you a glaring example. How many of you bought one of these? Next slide. A DVD rewinder. Some of you are going to go, I go get one of those. Anybody under 25 is going, what's a DVD? Some of you over 25 are going, maybe I need one of those. If you're over 50, go, does that do VHS too? You get it, right? Some of you actually said no. But that's pretty much a useless product. But there are people who bought that. It was produced by a company who sold all kinds of these. Now, there was a different company that decided that we needed some help in life, and so they produced these. The Bowlingual thing. What it is you take that little thing down there and you attach it to your dog's collar underneath his throat, and then you hold the walkie-talkie looking thing. And when your dog barks or growls, the walkie-talkie looking thing can interpret that for you, and you look at it and it gives you the script of what your dog is saying. Let me save you some money. Your dog goes, woof. What he's saying is, I want food. Your dog goes, woof, woof. What he's saying is, I want more food. Your dog goes, woof, woof, woof. What he's saying is, don't look at the carpet in the guest bedroom. There's a prize for you. But advertisers promise all kinds of things they can't produce. How many of you would agree that in the mind of the average American, while we understand the need for marketing and advertising products, that we would consider people who do professional advertising to have integrity that's a little lower down the totem pole? How many of you would agree with that? So James says, not just to advertisers, but keep in mind, James is saying this to people in the church because apparently integrity had moved a little bit down the totem pole in the church. Are you with me? Above all. You know what above all means? Whatever is here, you're to be up here. James says, above all, again, insider church language, so you know exactly who he's talking to. Do not swear. Now, James isn't talking about cussing. Some of you are going, thank goodness. James is saying, you don't need to promise with an oath. You don't need to say, I promise, I swear, my mother's grave, whatever. James is saying, you don't got to do that. If you're a person of integrity, if the norms of life are here and your integrity is up here, James says, just simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. You don't have to promise with an oath. And what was he saying to them? Not by heaven or on earth. Now, why does James say that? See, back there in that day, the Jewish people never spoke the name of God. Like, I've got a friend who is a former missionary to Jewish people, and she has great respect for Jewish people. But whenever she writes the word God, she writes G space D. Because they would never say the name of God, because they saw God, they had a great perspective of God high and lifted up, and they did not feel that they were worthy to say his name. And so what Jewish people would do then, and I'm imagining even some today, they would invoke the characteristics of God. So in this case, when they're saying these words, when he's saying, do not swear, not by heaven or earth, because they were involving God as the creator of heaven and earth. They're attaching extras to their stuff. Or by anything else, your mother's grave. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. Now here, condemned has a couple different meanings. The English translation, we just have one meaning, and it's condemned. And in James's case, condemned is a legal term. It's someone who has gone before the court. They have been found guilty. You cannot trust them. And basically it carries with the idea, don't do business with them, don't date them, don't trust them. It's a legal term. But it also had a very everyday use kind of term. And instead of being condemned like a legal term, like someone who was found guilty in a courtroom, it also carried the idea with it that they would be disconnected. What James is saying is someone who doesn't have integrity, someone who's, you can't trust their yes to be yes and their no to be no, that basically they become disconnected from everybody else in life. They become disconnected from their kids, disconnected from their spouse, disconnected from their teammates, disconnected from their their fellow workers, disconnected ultimately with God. And James says that we should go through life letting our yes be yes and our no be no. In other words, we should claim less and do more. James would say, husbands, don't tell your wife how much you love her, and because you love her, you're going to take the dishes out of the dishwasher and you're going to fold the towels out of the dryer. Don't do that. Just go and take the dishes out of the dishwasher and take the towels out of the dryer. James is saying that for you to walk out of discouragement, you've got to stop talking and start doing. As you can tell, I'm still fighting a cold. James is saying, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Empty promises are to be replaced with integrity. See, this is the most overinterpreted verse in the entire Bible, or one section of them, because people are always trying to make this say something that makes them feel better. Here's the bottom line. You have to personalize this little passage of verses based on what we've just shared. And you have to ask your question of yourself. Where do I need to start following through? Where do I need to start following through? On your job? Doing your chores around the house, kids? Keeping your promises to your children, mom and dad? Keeping your promises to one another, spouses? Number 6, James says, our independence should be replaced by prayer. Some of you understand that the human soul has an instinct for independence. We don't like needing other people. Would you agree? And so James then starts asking them some questions. If you're going to live independently and you're going to say you don't need the fellowship of one another, that you may not even need the fellowship of the Holy Spirit and the forgiveness of Christ, think about what you're really saying about your independence and why maybe you really do need those kinds of things. James says, is anyone among you in trouble? Now, when James says, is anyone among you in trouble, the idea was, is anyone here having to continually endure evil? Remember, these are people who had said yes to Jesus, and after they had said yes to Jesus, they had the full authority of the Jewish authorities and the Roman government come down upon them in a very persecutorial way, and they began to scatter throughout all of Judea and Samaria and all of those kinds of places. James has said, are any of you still having to endure any forms of evil? Then you should pray. He says, is any one of you happy? Now think about what James is really asking. Keep in mind his audience. Are any of you happy that you have been scattered, that you lost your jobs, that you've had to relocate and you've been separated from your family? Are any of you happy? Then you should sing songs of praise about that. Is anyone among you sick? Now, sick gets used twice in this passage, and in the original language, and I don't do this very often, but in the original language, it's actually two different words in the Greek that only have one word in the English. Here, when James says, is anyone among you sick? The question is anyone among you feeling powerless? Now, when we think about getting sick, like you've got the flu real bad, or maybe a worst case scenario, you've got cancer real bad. But when you have a sickness, let's just stick with the flu. You can be knocked out for 3 or 4 days. You don't get out of bed. You just lay there, your head covered. And if you're anything like me, I tell my wife, if I survive this, I'll see you next week. Right? And so physical sickness kind of sucks life out of you. It takes the power out of you. Fair enough? So there's the physical component. But when James says sick, he's talking about the physical for sure. But he's also talking about the other things of life that are emotional. See, some of you in this room, you know what it's like to have the flu and be knocked out for 3 or 4 days like I was last week. But others of you, you know what it's like to have your heart broken and it literally knocks you out for 3 or 4 days, maybe 3 or 4 months. The grief of a lost friend, spouse, family member, loved one. The heartbrokenness of being betrayed by someone you loved. The emotional drain that goes through the loss of a job, or if you were one of the people who lost your home several years ago when the economy took a downturn. It has a way of sucking life out of you, and James is saying is as debilitating as having physical sickness. Now see, back then, they were started this understanding, well, if you were sick or if bad came into your life, it is because you have sinned. There's still a version of that going on today. You see it on television. It's called prosperity gospel. It's not biblical. But it happens. It happened in the first church, and it happens in the television church today. And James is saying, no. Sometimes when you get sick, you get ill, it knocks you out. Sometimes when you have adverse circumstances, like in their case, you have lost your home, you've lost your job, you're separated from family. All you want to do is curl up in the fetal position and cover your head with a blanket and a pillow and just cry and not be bothered. It takes the life out of you. James is saying it has nothing to do with sin at all. James is saying, I want you to understand these kinds of things are part of life. If any among you are sick, let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil. Now, have any of you ever been to a prayer service and they pull out the little thing of oil and they kind of like touch you on the head? Yeah, I believe in that. We practice that. That's not how they did it back then. Back then, when someone was sick, emotionally, physically, whatever, they would literally strip down to their skivvies. And I don't mean this in any kind of a sexual or erotic way, but just literally as comfortably naked as a person could get. And they would do a full olive oil body massage so that their body would soak in the olive oil, which was believed to have had healing components. And then with that whole body oil massage, James is saying that's kind of like calling the elders of the church around you and laying hands on you, and the positive Spirit of Christ and the work and the power of the Holy Spirit that flows through these elders of the church would flow into your body and bring about healing, the same way as if you were getting an all-over olive oil body massage. And by the way, when James says elders, do you know what he's talking about? He's not talking about the sense like we have elders here and they're like our super spiritual people. Some of you know them and you know, I'm just joking. James is saying an elder is literally someone with proven spiritual strength. Proven spiritual strength. That's exactly what it means. That's all it means. Let me call a time out here for a second. This alone right here, call on the elders of the church, someone who has a certain maturity that shows a proven spiritual strength, is exactly why it's important that every one of us in this church, and I would say in every church for that matter, be involved in a connection group. Because some of you have proven spiritual strength in life, and you need to be passing on in the form of a spiritual sense, an elder, to the others. It has nothing to do with age or life stage. You could be 21 years old and have a proven spiritual strength because you gave your life to Christ at 4 years old in Awana, and have a 60-year-old in there who just gave their life to Christ last year. Who's the elder? 21-year-old, right? And you need to be in there so that we can learn from one another. As a matter of fact, let me take this a step further. Starting the first week of June, it's there in your worship folder, and you've seen it in my emails, and it's on our website and Facebook page and everything else. We have a series of classes called Connect University. We just call it Connect You. Y'all need to be in there, not just the 3 of you who have signed up. You need to be in these classes on spiritual disciplines. You need to be in these classes on apologetics. You need to be in the Financial Peace University and learn how to handle funds God's way, because the elders of this church, so to speak, the people who have proven spiritual strength in the areas of spiritual disciplines, in the areas of understanding apologetics, in the areas of knowing how to manage money God's way, want to share with you and develop you in the exact same way that James is talking about here. Because some of us in this room, if we're going to be really honest and don't point, we're sick financially. It's because we've never learned to manage money God's way. Some of us in this room, we have some pretty sick thoughts about God and the church. It's because we've never taken the time to open the book of God and understand what spiritual disciplines the Bible says, and so we make them go based upon 21st century philosophy, not biblical theology. You need to be in these classes. We don't offer them just because I've got nothing else to do. It's for you. And James says that's so important. That's a way of being a part of being around the elders of the church and developing these kinds of things. And then he comes back and he says, let the elders of the church pray over them and anoint them with oil and make the sick person, there's that word again, well. And the Lord will raise them up, and if they have sinned, they will be forgiven. How do you do that? Well, therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. Again, James is not talking about someone who has sin. This second word, sick, is the use of the word, what we would call weary. It's not about sickness that comes about as a result of sin in your life, although we have to be honest, there is some sin that causes sickness. For instance, if you commit the sin of gluttony because you eat little fried cubes of lard every day for 40 years, eventually you develop heart disease, right? Well, the gluttony allowed you to do that, and so that sin caused sickness. But all the sickness in life isn't caused by sin. Sometimes life just has a way of wearing you down, and that's what James is talking about. And he says, well, confess your sins to each other. He doesn't mean that you necessarily have to sit around a room and after singing Kumbaya, you have to talk about all the stuff you saw on the internet that you shouldn't, or how you treated your boss, or how you treated... He's not talking about all that. It's not necessarily a bad idea. It builds accountability. But what James is saying is this: whatever this looks like for you, you should choose to become vulnerable, not prideful. Does that make sense? Become vulnerable, not prideful. And if you do, the prayer of a righteous person. Now, it's a really interesting choice of words. James doesn't say the prayer of a perfect person. As a matter of fact, I believe so strongly in this, we don't let perfect people pray. You know why? There aren't any. Chief among them. But James says the prayer of a righteous person. What does that mean? Righteous person means someone who is in right standing with God. Right standing with God comes about when you trust Jesus in everything. You trust Jesus in your generosity. You trust Jesus in your empathy. You trust Jesus in your perseverance. You trust Jesus in your integrity. All these things that James has been teaching, it leads right up to this understanding of personal righteousness. He said Elijah was a human being even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain in the land for 3.5 years. And then in verse number 18, he begins with the word again. Now what's he saying here? Again is another word that gets used that means what? Perseverance. So again, or to persevere, he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Now here's the question. You're actually going to get a chance to do this in your connection groups this week. If you aren't a part of a connection group, this might be the last one for the summer. Go anyway. You get a chance to have this conversation. It might be one of the most important conversations you'll have in 2018. Who is helping you carry your troubles in 2018? If we were going to be real vulnerable in here this morning, and I promise you we're not about to do this, but I would start down here with Tootie, and we would work our way all the way around the room, and I ended up down here with Esther. And every one of us stood, and I said, who is helping you carry your burdens in 2018? What's the one name you would give us? Now, you have to have Jesus with skin on. He doesn't count. James is talking about literally within the body, the faith, the fellowship. Now, some of you would say, why spouse? Absolutely. But do you know what it's like if you come in and all you do from the time you get home from work through dinner until you go to bed is unburden yourself to your spouse? That lasts about what? 3 days if you have a great spouse, 3 weeks? By 3 months you're single again, right? You've got to have 1 or 2 people in your life. This is why Connect University, this is why connection groups are so important, that can carry your burdens with empathy. With empathy. If you weren't here last week, go back and listen to last week's conversation. It's an incredible introduction to all of this. James says, who is that one person? And it's got to be more than your spouse. And then James ends this up. Number 7. You have wandering replaced by forgiveness. Now, when I say wandering, I mean there is the physical component of people who wander away, but there's also the mental, emotional component of just being distracted. Some of us aren't ever going to leave this church We just get distracted from the realities of the spiritual life. There was a man who was very good with Morse code, and he had been working for the telegraph company for a number of years. And as the telegraph company continued to reach people all across the country, their community began to grow and new businesses. And he'd been doing the telegraph thing for a number of years, and he was ready for a change. And there was a newer business that had been prospering, and they had put an ad in the paper that week saying that they were hiring for one new position. The man thought, hey, I think I'd like to switch positions. I've got a good track record here. I'm going to go in and apply for that job. He said when he went in and walked into the office to apply for that job, there were like 30 other guys already sitting there. And he had this sick feeling come over him. And he walked over to the receptionist and he said, my name is, and I'd like to talk to the boss about getting this job. She said, certainly, would you have a seat at number 31 back there? We'll call you when it's your turn. And he went back and he sat down and he looked around the room. And of course, there are other employees in there and there's somebody clamoring away on what sounds like a typewriter. The receptionist is doing her thing. Some of the guys there are already talking to each other. There's just this little din of noise. And he sits back and he thinks, you know what, this is a waste of my time. I'm number 31. These guys have been here for a while. I think I'm going to leave. And he started to get up and he thought, you know what, it's my day off. I'm here. I really do want to see if I can get this job. I've been doing the telegraph thing for a long time. I'll just wait. And he sits down and he sits back and he closes his eyes and just kind of blocks out seemingly everything for about 4 minutes. And then he stands up. He walks past all the other guys. He walks over, knocks on the boss's door, opens it, and walks in. Everybody's going, what's he doing? We were here first. He's cheating. He's cutting in line. That's not right. He walks in, and about 2 minutes later, the boss comes out with his arm around this guy. And he says, just want you to know, you all can go home. I'm hiring him. And everybody's looking up, and they're angry, and they're irritated, and they're upset. And they're like, why? The boss said, what you thought was a typewriter was somebody over there pecking away in Morse code. The first person to get out of their seat and walk into my office gets this job. And he said, no one else was listening. Now, right now, this moment, Connect Church, Memorial Day weekend, and God is speaking. He's speaking through James. And he's asking you the question, are you listening? See, some of you, without even the person sitting next to you this morning, are going through a season of profound discouragement. When I say profound discouragement, I don't mean you had a bad hair day. I don't mean you had a flat tire. I'm talking about a season in your life where the depression is starting to overwhelm you and it's weighing you down. You've got a broken marriage, but you're too prideful to let other people know. And so you're not pride because you won't be vulnerable. Your marriage just gets worse each day and you hope it's get better. You're just not taking steps for it to get better. Some of you have got a wayward teenager. They are running away from you. They're running away from God. They don't want anything to do with the family. They know everything. You've got that going on. Some of you, even in this room this morning, you're dealing with your own drug issue. It could be prescription medication. It could be something you did in downtown Phoenix last night, but you're struggling with that. Others of you are dealing with a form of depression that you can't even put a name to it. And you're fighting through a very, very difficult season in life right now. And this God, this brother of James, the author, who is the pastor of this first church, who wrote the first book that goes into the book we call the Bible, this God is speaking to you. What's he saying? He says, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth, in light of today's conversation, let me paraphrase that. The David Harris translation says, because I don't talk church language, my friends at Connect Church, if one of you should be motivated to forget, and someone else would bring that person back, remember this. Whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. Here's what God is saying. God is saying, I am never motivated to forget you. As a matter of fact, there is only one thing that God is ever motivated to forget. Because of the cross of Jesus Christ, God is motivated to forget your sin and my sin. Some of us in this room this morning, we're wandering. Some of us in this room this morning, we never miss a Sunday at Connect Church, but we're distracted. We're forgetting. Some of you in this room this morning, you are walking alone through a season of discouragement. God says, that's not my plan. As you've heard me say time and time again over the last year and a half, at Connect Church, whatever you're facing, no one walks, talk to me, alone. We all walk together. So bow your heads, and I'm going to pray for you. As I'm praying, maybe I pray in an area or touch on a topic that's your topic. Talk to God about it this morning. Father, thank you for giving us these weeks in gym class. Jesus, sincerely, not flippantly, thank you for all those conversations you had when you and James were sharing bunk beds hundreds of years ago. And you said things to him that never resonated until later in life when he chose to accept you, not just as his brother, but as his Savior. And all those conversations began to make sense as he went off and wrote the first book of the New Testament and pastored the first church of the New Testament. And human nature is consistent, and we're dealing with things at Connect Church that they dealt at the first church of Jerusalem. There were broken families. James and the leaders and the elders in that church had to develop ministry to deal with broken families. There was unemployment. There was mental and emotional depression in the clinical sense, and deep-seated personal discouragement in the literal sense. There were people who would easily get distracted and forget to have the main thing be the main thing. James is reminding them that if we forget all that Jesus is about, we're wasting our time gathering here on the weekends. With your heads bowed and your eyes closed, how many of you would say, David, I'm dealing with some of this in my own life right now that other people may not even know about? Can I see your hands? I'm not going to point you out. I'm going to pray, and whatever it is, the topic that's in your mind right now, you fill in the blanks as I pray this prayer. Dear Jesus, I'm struggling, and I am struggling with. You fill in your own blank. Jesus, I don't know if it was pride or what, but I've not been sharing this with other people. And I'm fighting discouragement and overwhelming odds, maybe even forms of depression. Jesus, I confess that I'm distracted. Jesus, there's some stress in my life, and quite frankly, I'm motivated to forget some of that stuff. But Jesus, I need you today. Memorial Day weekend, Connect Church, 2018. James chapter 5. Jesus, here's my issue. Name that issue to him. Jesus, would you lead me to an elder, someone with proven spiritual maturity that I can safely talk to and pray with so that I don't have to carry this burden alone? Jesus, I love you. Thank you for loving me. I pray these things in your name. And everybody said,